I was standing in my kitchen sipping on my morning coffee when I heard the sound of heavy machinery growling outside. At first I thought maybe my neighbor was having some construction work done. But when the rumbling didn't stop, my curiosity got the better of me. I set my coffee down, walked to the window, and nearly choked on air. There, right in front of my driveway, were two massive bulldozers, their steel blades gleaming under the morning sun, completely blocking my only entrance and exit. And standing in front of them, arms crossed like she had just conquered a kingdom, was none other than Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood HOA. I stepped outside, keeping my cool though my blood was already starting to simmer. Karen, dressed in her usual overpriced yoga pants and a blazer that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager," spotted me and smiled like she had just caught a rat in her house. "Good morning, Jake," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I'm glad you're here. I wanted to talk to you about, well, this." She gestured dramatically at my farm as if it were some kind of biohazard. "We've decided that your property no longer aligns with the aesthetic standards of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "We? The HOA?" she said with a condescending chuckle. "And since your farm is such an eyesore, we've decided to reclaim this space for community development." I folded my arms, studying her like a bizarre museum exhibit. "Reclaim?" I repeated slowly. "Yes," she said as if she were explaining basic math to a child. "Your property borders our beautiful HOA neighborhood, and frankly it brings down our home values. We're moving forward with plans to repurpose it into something more visually appealing." She flicked her hand dismissively toward my fields, where my crops swayed peacefully in the breeze. "Maybe a dog park or a new clubhouse." I took a deep breath, forcing down the laugh that was bubbling up. She had no idea who she was messing with. "You can't just block my driveway," I said. "I own this land." Karen rolled her eyes and pulled out a stack of papers from her purse. "Actually," she said, holding them up as if they were sacred texts, "these documents show that the HOA has the right to make adjustments to surrounding areas for the good of the community." I leaned forward and skimmed the top page. It was laughably vague, full of legal jargon that said a whole lot of nothing. "Karen," I said, shaking my head, "this doesn't say anything about my land." "It doesn't have to," she said smugly. "The HOA guidelines give us discretionary authority to enforce aesthetic cohesion. And right now, your farm is in violation of our community's standards." I looked at the bulldozers, then back at her. "So what's your plan here? You think you can just roll in and take my property?" "Oh, we won't have to take it," she said sweetly. "We'll just make it inconvenient for you. Once you realize how much of a hassle it is, you'll probably want to sell. And when you do, the HOA will be more than happy to take it off your hands." I stared at her for a long moment, my expression unreadable. Then I let out a slow chuckle. Karen's smirk faltered slightly. "Something funny?" she asked. "You have no idea what you've just done," I said. Her smile returned, but there was uncertainty behind it now. "Oh, I think I do." I shrugged. "All right," I said. "Have it your way." With that, I turned on my heel and walked back toward my house, feeling Karen's eyes burning into my back. He probably thought I was retreating, giving up. She couldn't have been more wrong. Inside, I grabbed my phone and made a call. "Hey," I said as soon as the line connected. "You're not going to believe what's happening right now. Get over here." Within 20 minutes, my lawyer, Steve, pulled up, though he had to park on the side of the road since, my driveway was currently blocked by literal construction equipment. He stepped out, took one look at the scene, and let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She actually brought bulldozers?" "Oh yeah," I said. "She thinks she owns the place." Steve grinned. "Well, that's going to be a fun surprise for her." We walked back outside, where Karen was still standing, now chatting with a few HOA board members who had arrived to bask in her supposed victory. As soon as she saw me approaching with Steve, her smile flickered. "What's this?" she asked. "This," I said, gesturing to Steve, "is my lawyer. And he's here to help clarify a little something for you." Steve pulled out a thick folder of paperwork and handed it to her. "This is the official property deed for this land," he said. "As you'll see, it's been owned by Jake's family for over 70 years. It's private property, not part of the HOA." Karen's lips thinned as she snatched the papers, skimming them quickly. Her eyes narrowed. "There has to be a mistake," she muttered. "The HOA has no authority over this property, Steve finished for her. In fact, your little stunt today, blocking his driveway, that's trespassing and obstruction. We could call the sheriff right now. One of the HOA board members, a balding man in a pastel polo, paled. Trespassing, he echoed. Oh yeah, I said casually. And considering you're interfering with my ability to operate my farm, I could easily sue for damages. But I'm a reasonable guy, so I'll give you a chance to move the bulldozers now before I take this to court. Karen's face was a twisted mess of disbelief and fury. She looked at the board members who were now visibly sweating. One of them leaned in and whispered something to her, but she shook her head violently. No, she snapped. This can't be right. There has to be a loophole. Steve smiled politely. There isn't. And if you don't clear out, I'll be filing official charges first thing tomorrow. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely nervous. She turned back to me, her face tight with suppressed rage. You think you've won, she hissed. I smiled. I know I have. She glared at me for another long moment before whipping around and barking at the bulldozer operators. Move them back, she snapped. For now. The engines roared to life and slowly, begrudgingly, the bulldozers were reversed off my driveway. As they moved away, I turned to Steve. Oh, she's not done, I murmured. He nodded. Not by a long shot. Karen wasn't just going to back down. She was going to fight this hard. What she didn't know was that she was already doomed. Because if she thought this farm was all I owned, she was in for the shock of a lifetime. The next morning I woke up early, not because of any farm work, but because I knew today was going to be interesting. The sun had barely started its climb when I stepped onto my porch with my coffee. I didn't have to wait long. A convoy of expensive SUVs rolled up to my driveway, the same one that had been blocked by bulldozers just yesterday. Karen stepped out first, wearing a smug expression that told me she wasn't done playing games. Behind her, a few HOA board members followed, looking much less confident than they had the day before. I watched them approach, amused by the way Karen carried herself, as if she were marching into a boardroom where she was about to close a big deal. She stopped a few feet away from me and adjusted the oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. The board members flanked her like nervous underlings waiting for their boss to give orders. Jake, she said, her voice overly polite in a way that set off alarm bells. I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I sipped my coffee and let the silence drag. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She sighed as if she was dealing with a difficult child. Look, I understand you feel like you have some sort of claim to this land, but the HOA has done some digging, and we believe there are certain legal ambiguities that could work in our favor. I chuckled. Legal ambiguities, huh? That's funny. My lawyer didn't seem to think so. Karen's smile tightened, but she didn't drop the act. We wouldn't want to get into a drawn-out legal battle, would we? That could get expensive, time-consuming, stressful. I raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a threat? She waved a manicured hand dismissively. Of course not. I'm simply proposing a solution that benefits everyone. I already knew where this was going. Let me guess. You want to buy me out? She beamed like a teacher proud of a slow student. Exactly. The HOA is willing to make you a very generous offer. Much more than what this farm is worth. She said the word farm like it was an insult. I pretended to think about it. And what happens if I say no? Her smile didn't waver, but her tone darkened. Then we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. Our lawyers are very good at finding loopholes. You might win in the end, but it'll be a long, exhausting fight. And in the meantime, you'll be dealing with constant HOA enforcement. You think yesterday was bad? That was just a taste. I nodded slowly, setting my coffee down on the porch railing. That's a really interesting proposal, Karen. But I have a counteroffer. She perked up, clearly expecting me to name a price. How about you and your HOA pack up and get off my land before you embarrass yourselves any further? I said with a grin. Karen's face darkened instantly. Excuse me. I stepped forward, enjoying the way the board members shifted nervously. You think I don't know what you're trying to do? You think you can bully me into selling my property because you don't like how it looks? Because you think your overpriced cookie-cutter houses give you the right to dictate what happens beyond your little neighborhood? Her jaw clenched, but I wasn't done. You seem to be under the impression that you have power here, I continued. That's adorable. But here's the thing, Karen. I don't just own this farm. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. I own the entire land your HOA is built on. The silence that followed was almost comical. Karen blinked at me as if I had just spoken in a language she didn't understand. The board members looked at each other, their faces slowly shifting from skepticism to sheer panic. That's not possible, Karen finally snapped. The HOA leases the land, I interrupted. From my family. Or rather used to. The lease expired last month. Didn't any of you bother checking? One of the board members pulled out his phone so fast you'd think it was a gunfight. Karen, on the other hand, refused to believe it. You're lying, she said, but her voice wasn't nearly as confident as before. I shrugged. Feel free to look it up. But here's the simple version. Every house in your precious HOA sits on land that I now legally own. Which means, Karen, that you don't own your house. You don't own your street. You don't own anything. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. That's ridiculous. We pay property taxes. You pay for the houses, I corrected. Not the land they're built on. And now that the lease is up, I can do whatever I want with it. The board member who had been frantically typing on his phone suddenly paled. He's telling the truth, he mumbled. Karen spun on him. What? The man swallowed hard. The lease agreement ended last month. The land, it belongs to him. The silence stretched on, thick with disbelief. Karen's hands clenched into fists. This can't be happening, she whispered. Oh, but it is, I said cheerfully. Which means you and your little HOA have a big problem. He rolled back to me. You wouldn't dare evict an entire neighborhood. I shrugged. Wouldn't I? You were ready to bulldoze my farm for a dog park. Why shouldn't I return the favor? Her eyes blazed with fury, but she wasn't in control anymore and she knew it. The board members, sensing the power shift, started to back away, murmuring among themselves. They knew they were in deep trouble. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't ready to accept reality. This isn't over, she hissed. We'll fight this. We'll take you to court. I grinned. Go ahead. You'll lose. And when you do, I'll make sure to personally oversee the demolition of your house. Her breath hitched, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. I leaned in slightly. And just for fun, I might turn the land into something extra special. Maybe a community farm? A nice place for rescued animals? Something to really mess with your aesthetic. Karen took a step back, her entire body trembling with rage. You think you've won, she spat. I tilted my head. Haven't I? Her nostrils flared, but she had no retort. She turned on her heel and stormed back toward her car, shoving past the stunned board members. One by one they followed, muttering among themselves, already trying to figure out how to salvage the disaster she had caused. As I watched them go, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of victory settle over me. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. She'd try to find another way to fight back. The problem for her was that she had already lost. She just didn't know it yet. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, not even when the evidence was staring her in the face. The moment she stormed off my land, I knew she was planning something. It wasn't a question of if she'd retaliate, but when. She had spent too long lording over that neighborhood, dictating how high someone's hedges could be or what color their shutters had to match. Losing control wasn't an option for her. And if she couldn't manipulate me with fake legal threats or bulldozers, she'd try something worse. I didn't have to wait long. The very next morning I was woken up by a loud, persistent knocking at my front door. When I opened it, I was greeted by two uniformed officers standing on my porch. One of them, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, gave me an apologetic nod while the other, a younger guy who looked fresh out of the academy, held a clipboard. Mr. Jacob Peterson? The younger officer asked. That's me, I said, already having a pretty good idea of why they were here. We received a complaint from the Homeowners Association about illegal activities on your property, he said, glancing at the clipboard. They claim you're running an unauthorized commercial farm in a residential zone, and that your property is in violation of multiple community guidelines. I let out a slow sigh. Of course. If Karen couldn't take my land by force, she'd try to drown me in red tape. I folded my arms and looked at the officers. I assume they forgot to mention that my property isn't actually part of their HOA? The older officer, the one with the mustache, nodded. We figured as much. We checked the county records before coming over, but HOA complaints require follow-ups. I grinned. So you already know that their complaint is nonsense. The younger officer hesitated. Technically, we still have to do a routine check. I shrugged. Knock yourselves out. I led them around the farm, showing them everything from my crops to my livestock. There was nothing remotely illegal about what I was doing. My farm had been here long before the HOA was built, and it was fully compliant with zoning laws. The older officer seemed almost embarrassed to be there, while the younger one took notes like he had to justify the trip. After about 15 minutes they were satisfied. The mustached officer shook his head. Looks like a waste of time, he muttered. I smirked. I could have told you that before you drove out here. The younger officer cleared his throat. We'll file a report stating that there's no violation. If the HOA continues making false complaints, they could face legal consequences. I chuckled. Oh, trust me, I'll be making sure they do. The officers left and I watched them drive off, knowing full well that Karen wasn't done. Sure enough, within an hour I got an email from an HOA compliance committee, which I was pretty sure was just Karen in her living room with a laptop. The email was filled with legalese and threats about how I needed to immediately conform to the neighborhood's standards, or face financial penalties. I laughed as I read it. She still didn't get it. She was acting like she had any power at all. It was time to put an end to this once and for all. I called up my lawyer Steve and we went over our next steps. Since the HOA no longer had legal authority over the land, they had been charging homeowners fees that technically weren't valid anymore. That meant every single resident who had paid dues in the last month had grounds for a refund. Steve drafted up a formal notice, demanding that the HOA return the illegally collected fees or face a class action lawsuit. Then came the real kicker. I had the legal right to evict them. All of them. Every single home in that HOA was built on land my family owned. And now that the lease was up, I had the option to either renew it or terminate it altogether. Karen had pushed too far and I was done playing games. I didn't want to punish the residents. Most of them were probably decent people who had no idea what kind of mess Karen had gotten them into. So instead of issuing mass evictions, I made a different offer. I sent a letter to every household in the neighborhood, explaining the situation. They could either continue living there but under new management, meaning no more ridiculous HOA rules, no more arbitrary fines and no more Karen, or they could take legal action against the HOA for fraud and recover their lost dues. The neighborhood exploded. Within days, homeowners started turning against Karen and the HOA board. People who had once been terrified of stepping out of line were now demanding answers. The local news caught wind of the story and soon cameras were rolling outside the HOA office, capturing angry residents shouting at Karen as she tried to slink away in her luxury SUV. Then the final blow came. A legal notice arrived at Karen's door, informing her that not only was she being removed from the HOA board for misconduct, but that she was also personally liable for misappropriating HOA funds. Turns out she had been using community money for administrative expenses, which was just a fancy way of saying she had been paying herself with the residents' fees. Now with the HOA crumbling, she was on the hook for thousands of dollars. I watched it all unfold from my front porch, sipping my coffee as Karen's house was put up for sale. She fought it, of course. Tried to find a loophole, tried to rally the remaining HOA loyalists, but it was no use. The board had abandoned her, the residents had turned against her, and legally she didn't have a leg to stand on. Eventually she had no choice but to sell her home and leave. The day she moved out, I made sure to be outside. She glared at me from behind her car window as she sped away, but I just smiled and gave her a little wave. With Karen gone, I finalized my plans. I officially dissolved the HOA and turned the former HOA clubhouse into a community garden and recreation center. The people who had been trapped under Karen's ridiculous rules finally had the freedom to enjoy their own neighborhood without fear of getting fined for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of beige. And as for the bulldozers Karen had so confidently brought onto my land, I bought them at an auction for dirt cheap after the HOA went bankrupt. I had them repainted, put them to good use on my farm, and kept one parked at the edge of the neighborhood, just as a little reminder of how things had changed. Life went back to normal after that. The neighborhood thrived, my farm kept growing, and Karen was nothing but a bad memory. Every now and then I'd hear rumors about her trying to weasel her way into another HOA in a different town, but that wasn't my problem. She had learned a hard lesson, one she wouldn't soon forget. And as I stood on my porch looking out at my land, my home, and the neighborhood that was finally free, I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and smiled. Justice, as it turned out, smelled a lot like victory.